Okay, well, welcome to everyone who's joined to today's launch event for our new VoxDevLit on foreign direct investment. I'm Oliver Hannay, the managing editor here at VoxDev, and we're really excited to be joined by the senior editors who helped to bring together this VoxDevLit. Stefania Garetto, Nina Pavcnik, and Natalia Ramondo. You will hear from all of them on the key takeaways for policymakers from the economic research that they've summarized in their review. And throughout today's session, if you do have any questions, you can post them in the Q&A tab, and I will hop back on at the end to pose some of them to the senior editors and monitor that tab throughout. If you see any questions that you want to see answered, you can also vote on those using the Q&A function. We're really excited to launch this new VoxDevLit, and I'll put a link in the chat to where you can read and download this on the VoxDev website at the end of today's launch event. I also wanted to note that we've upgraded our website, so these VoxDevLits are now a little more interactive, and you can click between the chapters whilst on the website rather than downloading the PDF and having to scroll through. So hopefully that makes it a bit nicer to use and find some of the policy takeaways that are most relevant to you. And that's enough from me. So I'll hand over to Nina now for the presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this exciting research endeavor. I just first want to thank my senior co-editors and all the more junior co-editors. I encourage you all to invite them to follow up talks or discussions on various topics. Why have we decided to do a review on multinationals and development? As you know, multinationals enterprises are at the center of many policy debates in emerging and middle-income countries. On the one hand, they tend to be most productive and innovative firms in the world. They are also at the core of global supply chains. And as a result of that, they can potentially accelerate economic development in countries hosting them, both directly with their presence and also indirectly through linkages to local firms, workers, and other sectors. On the other hand, we frequently hear that when multinationals operate in lower income country settings in particular, they are frequently associated with, anecdotally, or blamed for either environmental degradation. This issue especially comes up in extractive sectors such as mining, forestry, agriculture. They also are associated with crowding out of productive local firms, undermining good governance, and also having lax labor standards. So what this review aims to do is inform both researchers and policymakers about what are actual effects based on economic research on all these factors. Our survey is organized a little bit differently from most of the existing surveys of multinationals or global supply chains. In particular, we focus on key topics that might be of interest either to researchers or policymakers listed here, ranging from implications of multinational enterprises for the macroeconomy to the environment, natural resources, linkages with local firms, as well as labor markets. In addition, our survey draws on scholars with expertise in each of these 5 areas. And as a result of that, we can get much more in depth and really hear from experts in each of these areas, as opposed to two people surveying the whole literature. The final thing is that we pay particular attention to the issues of multinationals in lower income countries. While we survey the literature as a whole, we do focus on implications for policy and evidence in lower income country sectors. And finally, while we reviewed the academic literature, we wrote and organized the survey so that it is accessible to policymakers and researchers wanting to enter this field. Most of the existing surveys are predominantly written by 2 people or 3 people surveying the whole literature, and are organized by theory models of multinationals and global value chains. So we hope that this survey presents a valuable complement to those existing endeavors. And I'll now hand it over to Natalia.
Yeah, thank you. We'll start the survey with talking about MNEs and the macroeconomy. The big macroeconomic question on this part of the survey will be what are the aggregate effects of the activity of multinationals in countries of different income level. So we want to understand what are the responses of these big firms to cost reductions, government incentives, integration agreements, tariffs, etc., changes in corporate taxes. So the main challenge in the literature has been like how to model this richness of multinational decisions. But we are there, so we have reached quantitative models that can deal with many product markets, many countries, many factors, and trade as an alternative to the activity of multinationals or a complement. Think about intra-firm trade or export platforms, for instance. At the same time, these models can deal with rich barriers to the activity of both trade and multinationals. Think about regional trade agreements, if tariffs are increased. For instance, here, when it was the China-US trade war, what happened with not only with trade flows, but also where multinationals want to reallocate their activities. So the advances are huge in static frameworks, static models, but there is a growing literature that try to deal with the dynamics and investment decisions of these firms. Those are the challenge so far. But we have research done in what are the effects of trade agreements like Brexit and the US-China trade war, as I mentioned, or the Canada-EU trade agreement. Next. In a nutshell, the main forces shaping the gains from multinational, from hosting these firms, is that they're going to increase productivity where they go, directly and indirectly, as we touch later on. But you can think broadly of 2 main factors, ones that are embedded in the firm, and these you can think about organizational skills, managerial skills, technology more broadly, their knowledge they're bringing directly and is part of the firm. And we think of these factors as transferable across the company, the multinational, to all the countries. But also, these firm factors interact with country factors. So you can think local factors of productions, like if we have middle managers in the country, engineers, plus the level of education of workers in general, how they match with the firm-specific factors. Also, there is domestic infrastructure at airports, ports, highways, etc. And of course, institutions, like how big is the red tape, corruption, expropriation risk, and other factors related to the rule of law. So basically, all the country factors interacting with the technology of multinationals will determine how much these firms can transfer and adapt to the local environment. We also touch next in this review about one important part of what multinationals do. These are the firms that shape innovation in the world. They're the largest innovators. And increasingly, they do innovation all around the world, the same way they do production around the world. So they are, in our language, they're separating where they create the ideas from where they use them to produce. So the emerging economies are one of the main locations where these firms go and establish these innovative activities. So basically, you can think of countries that are production hubs and some characteristics, some comparative advantage, like they can be lower income, lower wage countries, and countries that are centrally located to access consumers and other markets. But also there are countries that are good innovation hubs. They have well-developed manufacturing sectors to take advantage of synergies with the production part, and they have suitable workforce, as I mentioned, engineers, and of course they need good intellectual property right protection for firms to go and open innovation centers there. So, and one thing is that we don't, not only innovation is the same, you can think of basic research is different, but of product customization on other marketing strategies, business strategies. And as we have production chains, we have also innovation chains, and countries can specialize in different parts of these chains. And we touch upon that on this survey. Now, the main concern when we have innovation is that maybe countries that specialize in production worry that this low innovation will damage their growth prospects, and countries that specialize in innovation worry that innovation will take away from good middle income jobs. So the new quantitative frameworks that we work with can evaluate some and speak to these concerns, and even generate sometimes losses from receiving multinational activity. So in a nutshell, here there is a role for innovation policy to attract these companies, and also rethinking reshoring policies that also might affect not only production, but innovation activities. Next. Finally, in this chapter, we touch upon the activity of multinationals related to the global value chain. So, you know, this change generates complex links across countries and facilitate transmission of events like natural disasters or the financial crisis, for instance. So the fear is that not only trade, but also the activity of multinationals will create more vulnerability. So they will have a role, and that's what we touch upon on the chapter, on transmitting these good and bad shocks across countries. Next. The next chapter will talk about the environment and the role that multinationals have. So you have to think, this is from the World Bank report, multinationals account for 10% of their direct CO2 emissions in the world, and if you count their global value chain, it goes up to 60%. So we need to pay attention to what they do. So there is a tension here. Next. On the one hand, they are cleaner farms wherever they go, and also they are cleaner everywhere than the local farms. But next, on the other hand, they are also blamed for these pollution heavens. And this means that they produce more, multinationals from clean countries produce more emissions in their affiliates. So, and they do so in countries that are laxer regulation. So there is this tension, next, in the literature between what we call the pollution halo and the pollution heaven effect. So the big question is, do multinationals increase or decrease global emissions? So are they substituting for dirtier or cleaner farms? And what's the role of the supply chain? Or is responsible sourcing, for instance, one thing that is working and they are doing? So all of these questions are the ones that this literature try to tackle, and we review in the article. Related also, the multinationals have a role on the green transition and the creation of carbon superstars in middle-income countries. And here is not only MNEs will support the adoption of better technology, but also the creation of cleaner technologies. Remember, these countries in general are the home of endowments of renewable energy resources and minerals that are crucial for instance, battery production. And here in the article, we review the case of China and the creation of superstar farms in China in both the EVs and solar. Next. Finally, this chapter finished with how MNEs adapt to climate risk. And you can think about two types of risks. One is physical risk, and this is like due to natural disasters like floods or fires. And then we have transition risks that they come from these new technologies, policies, or because consumers are changing preferences. So this is still, there is no clear-cut results. The evidence goes in both ways in terms of what are the effects of multinationals. So we leave it posed in the survey, like what are the open questions to better inform policies for the future. And now I turn to Stefania.
So the next section is about multinationals and natural resources. When we talk about natural resources, what we refer to typically is agricultural land, water resources, fossil fuels, and other minerals. Now, these natural resources are special in a sense because they're what we call specific factors of production. What does that mean is that they're fixed in their location of supply, in contrast to more flexible factors like labor and capital that could be moved from a location to another. Natural resources are very important from a macroeconomic perspective for low and middle income countries, like I will show you in the next slide. And something that appears in the sector is that there is a small number of very large multinationals operating in this sector. So because of their sheer size in the host country, it's important to understand their role well. Now, multinationals in the sectors, like you will see also in other chapters of this review, can have positive and negative effects. There is evidence about the fact that they bring to the host country important streams of income by bringing technology, investment, and integrating suppliers and consumers in global supply chains that will be hard to handle without the scale of multinational corporations. On the other hand, unfortunately, there is also a body of evidence that shows the multinationals, hold on, Nina. Okay, can exacerbate domestic market failures, so they could lead to overexploitation of natural resources in these sectors. Next. So this is a picture that shows the macroeconomic importance of natural resources sector for low income and middle income countries, and here the income classification follows the methodology of the World Bank. In the next panel, we see export shares in agriculture and energy and mining for countries with different level of income, and it's immediate to see from the picture that for low-income countries, agriculture accounts for a very large, almost disproportionate share of export, while for middle-income countries is the share of energy and mining that appears to be more relevant. Now, when we look at value added in the right panel, what we can see is that land, natural resources associated with land, so agriculture and mining, account for about 5% of value added in low-income countries, while the share is significantly smaller in middle-income and high-income countries. Next. So the survey focuses separately on agriculture and mining because these two sectors have characteristics that differentiate them. They have commonalities, but there are also some differences. In agriculture, multinationals play a crucial role in the global food supply chains by connecting farmers' production to consumers. And again, this is one of those aspects in which the scale of multinationals is really important, because even the largest farmers in developing countries wouldn't have the capacity, the scale to make this happen. And this is going to be true both in the output markets and in markets of essential agricultural input. Now, through their role in agricultural inputs trade, multinationals can contribute to the process of structural change in developing countries. And this typically happens because these firms are more input intensive, more capital intensive, so they can bring in advanced technologies that are likely not to be present in these countries, without the presence of multinational corporations. Now, the problem is that there are currently a limited number of very large MNEs establishing this connection between farmers and consumers. And as we know in economics, when there is a small number of firms, this results into market power. In this case, it results into monopsony power towards the farmers, which means that the farmers have unique buyers, which are these multinational corporations. And because the multinational corporations are the unique buyers of these farmers' products, the evidence shows that farmers receive shares of revenues that are very low. They're too low from a social point of view. In conclusion, looking at agriculture, what appears from the evidence is that foreign direct investment in agriculture can have persistent positive local effects, but there is also a body of evidence that shows that can be associated with a deterioration in governance, and for that have negative effect on the country's long-run development trajectory. Next. Now, looking at mining, Concentration is a problem also in the mining sector. The global energy sector is dominated by very few large MNEs, which often coexist with state-owned companies. Now, a peculiarity of the mining sector is the fact that the supply chain has two distinct stages: extraction, which happens in the location of mines, and processing, which typically happens near the locations of demand. Now, typically, multinationals are involved in the ownership of both stages of production, basically to minimize frictions. But of course, as you can imagine, since extraction is limited in locations where the mines are located, while processing can happen pretty much anywhere, there can be international logistical frictions that play a role in shaping the supply chain. And for that, again, the scale of multinational corporations is really important. Also, in general, if you think about the nature of the sector, discovering new fields of oil and gas and improving the extraction technologies is something that is very costly. And again, the scale of multinationals is really useful in that direction. So on the positives, in the mining sector, multinationals bring investments and advanced technology to countries that are energy abundant, but could lack the technologies to really take advantage of these resources completely. There are currently limited insights in the existing literature, though, about which factors will drive the partition of profits between multinationals and local firms. Part of the literature has also emphasized the role of national institutions, local institutions, both on the good side and on the bad side. And here there is almost a contradiction in terms, because it appears from the existing research the multinationals like to locate in countries where there are good local institutions. So these institutions encourage MNE entry. But then on the other hand, there is also a body of evidence that shows that when MNEs enter developing countries in mining sectors, may actually contribute to an increase in corruption by paying bribes, working with rebel groups, and that leads to a deterioration of governance and increased conflict. Next. So to conclude, when we think about multinational natural resources, there is an overall view from the general public that MNEs in the natural resource extraction sectors could be negative for their disregard for the environment, again, the involvement in political corruption, and the undermining of good governance. And there is a long literature that speaks to the fact that resource extraction has been found to be associated with lower growth, corruption, and violence across developing countries. And the major concern, again, when natural resources sector expand a lot in a country is that they could be crowding out the manufacturing sector. This is what is known in the literature as the Dutch disease. And the idea is that these very large firms could be contributed to the displacement of the manufacturing sector by pushing up wages and other costs of intermediates. And actually, in some of the papers that we review in this section, there is specific empirical evidence that large-scale multinationals contributed to the reduction in scale of manufacturing firms in the countries where they're located. Thinking about policies, when thinking about policies, there is evidence that providing citizens with information about oil and gas discoveries can increase awareness and mobilization and counter the Dutch disease, monitoring corruption. But in general, it appears that the most effective policies are rounded policies that promote the growth of the multinational as a part of a comprehensive strategy addressing the specific complications associated with the sectors. Next. The next section speaks of MNEs and linkages with domestic firms or spillovers. Spillovers or linkages are typically a common rationale for government supports for MNEs, because we believe the multinationals can transfer their expertise, their technology, their better know-how to the economic actors in the local economy. This section focuses on three types of linkages: firm-to-firm linkages, which could be horizontal, backward, or forward, and I will define exactly what this means in the next slides. Linkages that could come from immigration channels, and linkages that could come through finance and technology adoption. Next. Now, coming to firm-to-firm linkages, the review looks separately at different types of linkages because the evidence on the effectiveness of these linkages vary. First, we look at firm-to-firm horizontal linkages, or the relationship between multinationals and other local firms. And there is really no consensus on the aggregate effects of these linkages, because multinationals could affect positively other domestic firm performance just through the transfer of their knowledge, which could be embodied in their products, could spill over to domestic firms by direct observation, also by worker mobility or by sharing common suppliers. But there could also be negative effects because MNEs, of course, could reduce the demand of domestic firms and increase their average cost. All in all, the bigger body of evidence appears to support the presence of positive effects through shared suppliers, but again, on aggregate, it's not clear whether the positive or negative effects are more important. When we look at backward linkages or linkages that come from firms that supplies to MNEs, again, there is a body of evidence showing the firms that supply to MNEs tend to experience substantial improvements, especially in productivity, but also in other measures of success, like product scope, quality, and reputation. While the evidence of linkages in the opposite direction, so looking at MNE suppliers' effect on local firms is weaker, mostly because of the scarcity of this type of linkages. There is limited reliance of local firms on MNE suppliers. In general, the review of this type of linkages show that there may be scope for policy interventions to increase MNE's reliance on local suppliers. Next. So in the continuation of this section, we look at spillovers coming from immigration, and in particular, high-skilled immigration. So there is evidence about the fact that in certain cases, and especially in the short run, immigration can be a substitute for FDI. Immigrant labor force reduces multinationals' incentives to invest offshore because both the use of immigrant labor force and offshoring are ways in which multinationals try to reduce their production costs, and the two essentially could have similar effects. So when we see an inflow of immigrants in a country, that tends to be associated to smaller reliance on offshoring from multinational corporations. On the other hand, we know that information asymmetries are really important for the decisions of firms to invest abroad. And there are several studies that have found that migrants moving across the world can help reduce communication and information frictions so that immigration can diminish information barriers and increase incentives for firms to invest abroad. And this will be an effect that tends to appear more in the long run. Another thing to observe is that when we look at the worker composition of multinationals, multinationals tend to hire more migrants than non-multinational firms. So this idea that migrants act as vehicles for knowledge transfer and innovation happens both inside and outside firm boundaries. The policy summary of this section brings up the conclusion that policy intervention ultimately should be aimed at encouraging migration as a strategy to increase trade and FDI links between developed and developing countries, because ultimately the effects in the long run appear to be positive. Next. Next. So the last portion of this section on linkages speaks through spillovers through finance and technology adoption. And here the idea is that well-functioning financial systems can attract foreign investment, encourage entrepreneurship, and stimulate expansion. Typically, firms are financially constrained or facing inefficient financial markets. They may not adopt innovative technology, they may not expand. And part of this missing expansion could be multinational expansion. In addition, there appears to be a important synergy between financial development and technological progress. In particular, there are many papers that look at the effect of the diffusion of technical innovation with an emphasis on finance, like, for example, the high-speed internet or mobile payments as catalysts for financial development. In the realm of these spillovers, the policies that have been proposed as being successful to attract FDI include trade and capital account liberalization. And here the idea is that relaxations of the restrictions of flows of international capital can foster the development of countries' financial systems and could facilitate foreign direct investment, especially in the form of mergers and acquisitions. And lastly, another thing that could be important is promoting the expansion of multinational banks, since they offer a network of financial services and expertise that could be relevant for foreign firms. And I will now give it to Nina.
So Stefania overviewed how multinationals can have spillovers for local firms. I will continue that discussion by focusing on the linkages that multinationals might have with labor markets. As Stefania mentioned, policymakers in host countries commonly support MNEs. And one of the justifications is that MNE affiliates in host countries are expected to create jobs. Usually they hope for higher quality jobs, and that arrival of these multinationals will also have positive spillovers for workers in the domestic firms. Theoretically, this is all possible, but what we have needed, whether or not this channel is plausible, is empirical evidence. And over the last 10 years, we have really gained researchers have gained access to the types of data and settings where they can much more credibly show whether or not multinationals have direct and indirect effects on workers. What this more recent evidence shows is that workers in multinationals do earn higher wages than in domestic firms. This is oftentimes based on a worker, kind of comparable worker that moves from a domestic firm to a multinational firm. In this premium, it's called multinational wage premium. These wage premiums are found both in high income and lower income countries. They tend to be a little bit higher in magnitude in lower income countries, ranging in the 6 to 9% for the same type of worker. What is interesting is that there's still discussion, why are there these higher wage premiums for workers that work in multinationals? And one potential explanation is that perhaps these wage premia are needed because job amenities in terms of kind of stressful work, hours worked, kind of in-kind payments are actually worse in multinational jobs than in domestic jobs. However, the existing but scant evidence points to the fact that, if anything, multinational jobs tend to have better amenities than domestic firms, and they also tend to have higher retention rates. So the debate kind of continues on why these premiums exist. Is it job amenities? It seems that job amenities are actually better. Is it labor turnover? Perhaps multinationals are offering higher wages to reduce labor turnover, or it could be that these multinationals make rents and share some of these rents with workers. Finally, we also have some evidence that workers that work in multinationals do not just necessarily benefit through higher wage premium, but can also, by working side by side with foreign managers, acquire valuable knowledge that future domestic employers reward. The literature then has also expanded our knowledge on how the presence of multinationals in host countries affects workers employed by domestic firms. And there, again, recent, much more detailed data and types of setting that help us tease out like how multinationals actually spill over to the domestic labor markets has enabled us to find more credible evidence on this channel. And what these studies have shown is that multinational entry or expansion tends to be associated with increases in employment and wages in domestic firms. Although kind of the actual magnitude and especially the evidence on the existence of wage effects tends to vary a little bit across countries. So one might wonder, well, why do these spillovers exist? And what the evidence so far shows is that multinationals can potentially improve outside options that workers have by altering the level and composition of the labor demand in the local markets toward higher paying jobs. Another channel that has been shown as playing a role is that multinationals, especially those who obtain source inputs from domestic firms, tend to, through those input-output linkages, increase wages and employment in these firms. So what are the policy implications of these findings? Well, first, it seems that, the evidence so far shows that there is ability of multinationals to positively impact workers, both directly and indirectly through higher wages and employment in host countries, although the exact evidence varies across country settings. Where more work is needed is how these multinationals interact with the informal sector. As you know, in lower income settings, about 40 to 60 or even more percent of workers actually work in informal sector, and it's important to understand how that sector interacts with the arrival of multinational firms. And finally, to the extent that multinationals do provide higher quality jobs, we also need further evidence to understand how the arrival of multinationals complements, for example, trade policy or policies like industrial policy with job creation. And some of the studies on that topic suggest that trade policy that encourages access to export markets can actually encourage the arrival of new multinationals, leading to arrival of kind of jobs in the formal sector. The second set of questions pertaining to the relationship between multinationals and labor markets in host countries focuses on labor standards. So as I mentioned in the introduction, multinationals operating in lower income countries are frequently blamed for lax labor standards. Whether or not they actually increase or decrease labor standards is ambiguous in theory. So in particular, on the one hand, multinationals could potentially deteriorate labor standards by introducing a race to the bottom before governments that are vying for their presence. We show evidence in the survey that vast majority of countries offer significant subsidies or tax reliefs to attract multinationals, and especially when these are big kind of mega deals, one could imagine that multinationals will have market power to negotiate for big tax cuts, but then also exert influence on the domestic labor market. On the other hand, to the extent that through all the channels that Natalia and Stefania have reviewed in their sections, multinationals actually improve incomes in lower income settings, that could lead to increase in labor standards. In addition, to the extent that consumers in high-income countries care about consuming goods that are made with kind of high labor standards, governments can actually pass some of the cost of improved labor standards to foreign countries. The upshot here is that, again, we need empirical evidence to inform how multinationals influence labor markets. And the evidence so far is very scant, but it's growing. Nonetheless, it remains underdeveloped, especially in light of continued push that policymakers in wealthy destination countries have toward regulating sustainability in global supply chains. So given that there is this push, it's really important that we continue to get additional evidence to inform this policy discussion. Recently, researchers that have focused on using randomized control trials in specific industries have helped us make progress on this area. So one thing that people find is that how multinationals affect labor standards in lower income country settings is going to very much depend on the quality of institutions that govern labor markets. So even sometimes countries might have strong de jure standards on the books, but de facto domestic firms may face very little enforcement. What recent field experiments suggest that if multinationals actually improve enforcement of labor standard mandates, their suppliers in host countries actually increase compliance with these standards, and that this oftentimes happens without downward effects on wages or employment in these suppliers. The other piece of evidence that's related to labor standards also suggests, and again, this is a small but growing literature, that exporters, oftentimes multinationals, can have monopsony power. And this monopsony power, combined with other market frictions in lower income countries, is another characteristic that we have to keep in mind, especially in agricultural value chains, as we think about the implications that multinationals have for workers. And what evidence so far has shown is that at least in certain value chains, multinationals may actually play an important role in influences workers and farmers' gains from exposure to international trade. This, combined with weak institutions in the countries, oftentimes leads multinationals to establish long-term trading relationships with local third-party suppliers in agricultural markets or garment or apparel markets. And this is called relational contracting. And what the literature has shown is that when multinationals have these long-term relationships, the future value of trade based on that relationship actually gives multinationals incentive and opportunity to monitor third-party contractors. And through that, multinationals actually exert efforts to privately enforce labor standards in these third-party suppliers. Most of this evidence is from coffee and apparel industries, but it shows that these sort of long-term relationships can improve prices to farmers and workers' conditions among suppliers. Again, based on very detailed industry studies that take into account the nuances and kind of institutional details of those industries, rely on randomized control trials, we have actually gained insight how multinationals themselves might have incentives to enforce labor standards. The final thing that I want to mention when we think about policy is that most of these studies currently focus on a specific industry. The majority of them are in agriculture or apparel. And as we think about labor standards, it's important to also understand what is the overall impact of responsible sourcing policies that many policymakers in high-income countries are trying to implement in global supply chains on workers in developing countries. And there, we oftentimes, unless we focus on specific industry, do not have the right data to answer that question. Yet some of the scant evidence that we have that actually takes these overall impacts into account suggests both that, in theory and in practice, the predicted overall effects of responsible sources are ambiguous, and kind of the evidence that we have so far seems to suggest that overall the impacts are small, but that the effects vary a lot depending on whether or not you're a worker that works in one of these multinational firms that practices responsible sources, as opposed to a worker that is linked to these policies through kind of general equilibrium effects on labor markets on firms in developing markets. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that incredibly interesting presentation. So we've had some questions come through, and feel free to submit some more using the Q&A function if you'd like to see them answered. So we have one from Matthew Smith, who asks how policymakers should balance the benefits from requiring multinationals to partner with local firms versus the extra costs that might reduce the multinationals' engagement in the country or region, and whether there's kind of any examples of where that kind of balancing act has worked well or failed. So I'll open that up to anyone who wants to take it.
Oh, I can take it if you guys are okay with that. So I think here the way in which maybe I will interpret or rephrase, and I'm not sure if this is where Matthew is going at. I don't think the survey speaks to requiring multinationals to partner with local firms. The idea is that there should be incentives for that to happen, right? And in principle, what we think and what we see from the evidence is that if multinational firms engage in activities with local firms, this could happen through the supply chain, for example. That is because it is a cost-efficient endeavor. So in principle, there shouldn't be extra cost associated with it, because otherwise there will not be an efficient decision from the firm. So, and again, Nina and Natalia will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there are specific parts in the survey where we speak to interventions that were made to require firms to partner with local firms.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And if anything, when we are looking, oftentimes the question that people get is like Stefania said, is these multinationals might have their own incentives to enter host country markets. So to the extent that they would be doing that already, the money that governments are using to attract them, especially if we don't have as much evidence on local spillovers, right, might not be well invested money. And as the survey suggested, we are getting more evidence on local spillovers, be it to local firms, to sectors outside of manufacturing, to local labor markets. But even with that evidence, there are still questions of interpretation. Are the spillovers that we are capturing true externalities, which are the ones that are the most aligned with subsidies or tax break being the optimal policy from the perspective of local host countries, or do they reflect another mechanism?
Thanks. And a interesting question from Randolph, who asks more about kind of the political side of things. So in terms of whether there's evidence on how multinationals might use their influence to capture policymakers in order to kind of preserve the power and control they have, or try and encourage kind of the race to the bottom that is mentioned in the review, where they get kind of policies that are super favorable to them, but might be at the expense of kind of the economy as a whole. So if anyone could maybe speak to that.
Yeah, I think the evidence on how FDI firms or multinational firms can potentially capture favors from developing countries is still scant, because as you can imagine, data on that is really difficult to get. I would say that both the section on natural resources and on local labor markets is probably the one that has like the most closely related evidence to that. But what that evidence points to is that if there's better local governance and information in those sectors, that tends to generate better outcomes for local markets. On the natural resource side, I would say on the labor standard sides, what the survey emphasized is that a lot of our studies focus on situations where there was either a unfortunate event, kind of collapse of a building, or that NGOs were heavily involved to attract attention to the working conditions in multinationals or their suppliers. So again, oftentimes we have evidence that's based on kind of very visible events, and what the evidence based on. So we have to keep that in mind. But what in the aftermath of those events, or when there's more scrutiny, it does seem to be the case that multinationals do have more incentive to encourage their suppliers to comply with or enforce labor market standards. The final thing, though, that I would say there is that we also have evidence that multinationals themselves, to because they have market power, because they do face a weak contract enforcement in lower income countries, have their own incentive to invest into these long-term relationships, and through that monitor their own suppliers, especially when they know that their customers might value a better working practices, and that the stability that these long-term relationships provide also benefits them directly by lowering costs and reducing the uncertainty of the relationship.
Can I add one thing? There is in the chapter about also labor markets and the MNE wage premium, there are some literature that evaluates those benefits, like those direct benefits, against the cost of countries or states of mega deals. This is more like focus on developed countries that have these big packages, but in the past we had these packages in countries like Costa Rica and Ireland, like back then, and there is an effort to try to evaluate if this is a net positive or a net negative, because these packages might be too big in some sense and may cannibalize other things that they can do, states especially can do with that money.
Yeah, and the evidence there, but it's for the United States, suggests that on average, the benefit is about like $34,000 more than kind of what is spent on the subsidy. And the authors, based on the scant evidence, think that perhaps the spillover effects of multinationals in lower income countries might be on domestic firms and workers might be higher, because there are not as many firms that are similar to multinational among domestic firms relative to a country like United States, yet we don't have direct evidence in lower income country settings that we do for the United States.
Great. We've had quite a few more questions, so I might just go through 2 or 3, and then you guys can tackle whichever ones you feel comfortable. We've had 2 about domestic content requirements for multinationals in host countries. So I guess, is there any evidence on those, and are they an effective policy for kind of fostering industrial development at home? We've also had a question from Mehdi on the effect of foreign direct investment on the quality of the final product, and whether there's kind of any change in the variety of product portfolios due to foreign direct investment. And then we did also have a question from Carlos about what the evidence says on the effect of foreign direct investment on domestic environmental quality. So 1 on domestic content requirements, 1 on the quality of final products, and 1 on domestic environmental quality. So yeah, I'll leave those to you.
So I'm happy to speak to the question on the quality and variety of the product portfolio. So in the chapter on linkages, part of the evidence that the chapter reviews is the one about backward linkages, so linkages between the multinational and the suppliers. And among the evidence that is reported supporting those linkages, there is evidence that this type of sharing in the supply chain lead to, yes, an increase in quality of the products and also an increase in the product scope, which is exactly what the person is asking, the variety of the products produced. Here again, the idea is that local suppliers will learn from the demand of the multinational about better ways of making things, better technologies, improvement that are required to fit in the supply chain of the multinational, and change their production structure accordingly, which is something that then we may think will also result in changes in quality and changes in product scope when this specific supplier is selling to other firms that are not necessarily the multinational, having then an increased effect, let's say, also on other local customers.
Yeah, I can add to that the question about local content requirements. So the survey doesn't provide any direct evidence on that. However, in the same chapter that Stefania just talked about on local firm linkages, one thing that is noted is that while these linkages with local suppliers generate productivity gains and kind of quality upgrading and product scope upgrading, the survey also notes that multinationals oftentimes do not source as much from local suppliers. And one of the open questions is, why do they not? And one way to increase sourcing would be to impose local content requirements. However, it is not, and we do have evidence that local content requirements do change trade flows in these global supply chains linkages. Some of that evidence is from NAFTA, but it is then to be seen that, like, if you're imposing these local labor requirements, would they also lead to the same type of productivity spillovers that people are finding in settings where they do not exist?
Talk 2 words about the environment question. And so I went through the slides. It's also in the review. There is 2 types of evidence on this. So one is the famous pollution heaven hypothesis, and it's true. Like, if you look at multinationals from very clean countries, they go abroad and they have a percentage of their emissions abroad is much higher. So there is pollution heavens, but that is offset by the fact that in any country you look at, multinationals are cleaner than the local firms, and they are cleaner if they come from a cleaner country, independently if they go to places with laxer regulations. So those two effects offset each other, and it's to be seen which one, when you put all together, which one dominates. And this one, it doesn't include another, let's call it positive channel, that is that the spillovers, the environmental spillovers, that, like, as we talked on the survey, we talk about productivity spillovers, but you can think like that multinationals influence domestic firms through maybe contracts called responsible sourcing to make them upgrade to cleaner technologies. There are some evidence on that about the green transition that we survey, and the creation of these carbon superstars. Maybe like FDI has something to do with that, but still it's very much work in progress and very, very important indeed.
Thanks. Maybe we have time for 2 more quick questions, if that's all right, and then we can wrap this up. So we had one from Tarek, who asks about your thoughts on multinational firms and structural transformation, and whether there's evidence on multinationals perhaps contributing to premature deindustrialization, or that economies are kind of bypassing manufacturing towards services. So that kind of bigger picture question. And then we also have a question from Pamela about whether there's any evidence on collaborations between multinationals and NGOs, and whether that contributes to kind of improving labor standards and promoting fair wages, etc. And yeah, if there's evidence kind of to support the effectiveness of those types of partnerships.
Yeah, I can speak to the second question. There might be this sort of partnerships. However, what more of the evidence suggests is that multinationals are responsive to the scrutiny of NGOs and kind of respond in terms of, like, kind of their compliance with labor market standards when kind of the light is shed on their existing practices by NGOs.
Great. Okay, well, we've come to the end of our hour, so thanks again to Natalia, Nina, and Stefania for their incredibly insightful presentations, and also to the whole team for putting together such a useful review. I've just put a link in the chat so you can go and read this VoxDevLit on our new and improved website, and also download the PDF so you can kind of delve into some of these topics in more detail and get some of those answers to the more specific questions. Thanks again, everyone. And yeah, well, I'll end things here.